Okay, hi, I'm Holly Alfano, the CEO of ILMA. Welcome to LubeTrends, our virtual town hall. I'd like to take a minute just to thank Chevron Oronite for sponsoring our 2020 LubeTrend town hall sessions. Before we get started, I want to share some exciting news. We announced last week that we are moving ahead with our meeting, and we're calling it ILMA Re-Engage. Embrace the change. It's going to happen in person, face to face, mask to mask, at a new time and new place from what was previously announced. We're going to meet June 2nd through 4th at the Hyatt Grand Cypress in Orlando, Florida. Registration will be opening soon, so keep an eye on your inbox. Today, we're going to discuss an important issue for ILMA members, the Hazard Communication Standard. A few weeks ago, OSHA released a proposal to update the rule. We're very fortunate that OSHA is here with us today to walk us through the changes and take our questions. I want to remind you that you should feel free to submit questions by clicking on the Q&A icon. The questions will be posted and I will sort through them and pose them to our panelists following the presentations. I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists. First, Janet Carter. Janet is a senior health scientist with the U.S. Department of Labor, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, and the project lead for the 2021 update to the OSHA Hazard Communication Standard. Jennifer Lawless is a senior industrial hygienist in the Directorate of Standards and Guidance, DSG, in OSHA's national office. She's a certified safety professional and works on multidimensional OSHA teams responsible for the rulemaking efforts in the DSG. She is responsible for writing the physical hazard sessions of the HCS and subsequent guidance materials that support the standard. Dina Holmes is a health scientist in OSHA's Directorate of Standards and Guidance in Washington, D.C. She began working for OSHA in 2003 in the Office of Biological Hazards and currently works in the Office of Chemical Hazards, Metals in the area of hazard communication. Sutton Puglia is an economist in OSHA's Office of Regulatory Analysis. She formerly worked with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now I would like to introduce the folks joining our panel for the Q&A session. Ann Ball, who is on ILMA's board of directors, is a manager of product health and safety and regulatory affairs. That's a big mouthful, Ann, at Simcoe Du Bois Chemicals. She's also, as I mentioned, an ILMA board member and serves on our executive committee as secretary. And Matt Levittown is also with us this afternoon. Matt is ILMA's Regulatory Policy Counsel. Now I'm going to turn the program over to Janet Carter with OSHA. Thanks, Janet.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to everyone today. I'm going to quickly switch screens here and share my screen so that I can control the slides. So bear with me for just a moment, please. Okay. So So let me get this. So I thought I had it. Uh-oh. Sorry, all. Somehow here we go. So sorry. Always a technical glitch. So can everyone see? If anyone can acknowledge, they can see the screen fine. They can see the slides.
Janet, I just see your name.
You just see my name, you can't see.
Janet, did you click the share screen icon in the center?
I did.
Then you have to click something at the top of the screen as well. There you go.
Can you see it? Can you see it now?
It's coming up. Yeah.
Okay, great. There we go. So everyone can see the slides now. Okay, so thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you today about the Hazard Communication Standard. Jen, Dina, and I will present the slides today. We'll go through these. What we want to do is go through the regulation, and Sutton has also graciously joined us to field any economic questions as well. So I want to start out by saying that this is an update to the Hazard Communication Standard. We have not changed the scope of the rulemaking. So if you were in before, you're in now. So, so just a really brief history of the hazard communication, or the globally harmonized system. The globally harmonized system was conceived at the UN. OSHA had a big role in helping to formulate the GHS. It was first published in 2002, and it is an internationally negotiated approach to hazard communication, which provides harmonized definitions for various hazards. It provides specific criteria for label elements and for the format and elements of safety data sheets. It has three basic focus areas, which are physical hazards, health and environmental hazards, classification for those hazards, and specific elements for hazard communication. Now, when people think about this, they should think about it as a living document, because it is updated based on not only the evolution of science, but also issues with implementation. This is a tripartite agreement. So it is an agreement, or it's a framework for a rule. It is tripartite. Industry, government, and NGOs like labor have worked to put this together. So let's switch gears here to the Hazard Communication Standard. Now, OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard was first promulgated in 1983, updated again in 1994, and it was in 2012 that OSHA aligned with the revision 3 of the GHS, which at that time it was, when we first started the rulemaking process, Rev 3 was the version that it was in. By the time we finished the rule, it was in Rev 5, but we had already begun that process. So this was the biggest change to the Hazard Communication Standard. And it, as I said, aligned with the GHS. It also updated the Hazard Communication Standard to a more systematic approach to hazard classification, more standardized and robust workplace labels, changes to SDS, and training. The safety data sheets were changed to the internationally accepted 16-section format, which closely aligned with ANSI. And OSHA requires and enforces sections 1 through 11 and section 16. Now, under the 2012 Hazard Communication Standard, this became a right for workers' right to know. That's what it was called. And it was a right to understand the information regarding workplace hazards through more comprehensive information and training. So what I want to do now is kind of change focus and go through what the rulemaking process is. Right now we're at the, we've just issued the notice of proposed rulemaking. We've entered into a comment period, which ends April 19th. So you must have your comments in by April 19th. This is open to the public. If someone requests a hearing, or if someone requests additional additional time for comments, then we will take those into consideration. If someone requests a hearing, we will grant that. Once we get all of the comments in from the public, from our stakeholders, then we will use that information to issue a final rule. So that's the basic rulemaking process. And we want people to comment on the rule, because that's really how we make our determination. So as for the 2012 proposal, we believe that this will improve and enhance worker protection through providing additional clarification of what we've already done through implementation. So what we're trying to do is codify some of the like letters of interpretation or our enforcement directive. We're incorporating new hazards and classes and categories, improving and streamlining some precautionary statements that have come about through alignment with Rev 7 of the GHS. And this also should facilitate international trade through increased alignment, because while we're looking to align with Rev 7, so is Health Canada, Europe, New Zealand, and Australia. So we'll all be working on the same revision, and I think that should help businesses a lot. Now, as with the 2012 rule, this is the basic framework we'll be keeping. So it remains the same, but the scope of the rule remains the same. OSHA believes that the changes and cost impacting businesses will mostly be borne by manufacturers, but these should really, the changes that we're making, they're not huge changes. Changes to STSs and labels should only come about if there are new hazards in your area. So we do think that the cost, we're hoping that the cost will be minimal, but we're asking for input on that. So I think that's good for that one. So the overarching kind of framework for this is there's four basic bends that the rulemaking is in. We're maintaining alignment with the GHS, and Dina and Jen will discuss that in a moment. We'll also be addressing some issues that have been identified through implementation of 2012. We've identified concerns of those complying with Health Canada's workplace standard. And we're also hoping to improve alignment with other U.S. agencies such as EPA and DOT. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dina to talk about the first of the issues.
Thanks, Janet. So the primary reason, as Janet indicated, that we're updating the hazard communication standard is to maintain alignment with the GHS. And as Janet again previously stated, the GHS is a living document, and these updates will align with revision 7 of the GHS. Some of the main changes to ensure that we are aligned are in the following areas, and we'll be talking more about these in depth throughout the presentation. For the health hazards, which are located in Appendix A of the standard, most of the changes are more editorial in nature. However, the main changes to Appendix A includes revised health hazard definitions, updated skin corrosion, irritation, and serious eye damage, eye irritation chapters. And then there are some general updates to some of the other hazard classes. And for Appendix B, which provides the requirements for the physical hazards, the most notable changes are to the flammable gas, the desensitized explosives, and the aerosols hazards. Now, with regards to Appendix C, which provides the required label elements, we are proposing a few changes to some of the required label elements. And then lastly, for Appendix D, which provides the requirements for safety data sheets, there are proposed updates to sections 9 and 11. So more specifically for the health hazards, again, we are proposing to revise all of the health hazard definitions. Now, the previous health hazard definitions weren't exactly consistent with respect to form or content, and many of them were taken directly from the OECD test guidelines. So the GHS subcommittee updated the definitions so that they would be more general and they would be more clear and concise and would be neutral with respect to the test guidelines. So we are proposing to make those updates as well. We're also proposing to update both the skin corrosion, irritation, and serious eye damage, eye irritation chapters. And the GHS revised these chapters in order to enhance clarity and user friendliness in the application of the criteria, and also to change the testing scheme to more of an evaluation scheme, since the GHS is in fact test method neutral. And the work on these chapters at the GHS was not exactly complete before OSHA published its updates to the hazard communication standard in 2012. We were actually able to pick up much of the concept, but we didn't actually have the final version at that time. So this update incorporates all of the editorial modifications that were made to these chapters. So the chapters don't propose any new provisions. However, and I guess you will see when you look at our red line strikeout version of the regulatory text, it looks like there's a lot of changes to these chapters, but they're actually just editorial changes so that we can ensure that the language and the format of these chapters are consistent with what's currently in the GHS. We're also proposing some general updates to several of the health hazard classes. And an example would be in the acute toxicity chapter. We are proposing to clarify that both data from animal tests and human studies should be considered in evaluating acute toxicity, excuse me. And this again is just a clarification. There's actually no change to the criteria. And now I'll turn it over to Jen to discuss Appendix B.
Thank you, Dina. So as you've heard a couple of times already, this update is to provide clarity and specificity to the hazards. And this can be seen in Appendix B, which addresses the physical hazards. So we're going to highlight some of the bigger changes to the physical hazards, which can be really seen in pyrophoric gases and unstable gases, flammable gases, desensitized explosives, and aerosols. But before we do that, we really need to just step back a second and realize that a lot of the information that was brought into the GHS was from the TDG on the very beginning. And the TDG doesn't really embrace all of the needs for the GHS because it deals primarily with transport. And transport is unimodal in regards to just being in transportation. I understand it's rail and ship and over the road vehicles, but its priority is just the mode of transportation. And that, coupled with the new developments of chemicals and the changing chemical dynamics, we realized that we needed in GHS to broaden and then also specify classification for some of the physical hazards to really address the hazards, because we use them, we store them, we handle them. We're not just transporting these particular hazards. Next slide, please. So under the proposal, these gases here, the pyrophoric gases and unstable gases, they have been placed under flammable gases in category 1A. These changes affect the hazard classifier and not the downstream user. That's really important to note. And pyrophoric and unstable are both in category 1A. Pyrophoric was not captured in the HASCOM 2012, but it was put into the GHS. It was, and the unstable gases were already handled. They were handled, but it was really, really broad, and we wanted to offer some clarity. So we thought we needed to specify the unstable gases. We also needed to specify some of the hazards associated with pyrophoric. So now they're both in category 1A. Next slide. So for flammable gases, in the past, the Hazard Communication Standard 2012, it was noted that flammable gases category 1 was really, really broad and often led to over warning and having some of the employers choose a chemical with a higher risk. So we went in and we decided that flammable gases, we needed to update them in the proposal. And we updated the label information. We streamlined the classification process. And we include now subcategories 1B for flammables. These updates also are reflected in labeling information. Next slide. So here you can see a screenshot of what the proposed standard will have for flammables. 1A now contains flammable gases, pyrophoric gases, and chemically unstable gases. Then there's hazard category 1B, which is flammable gases. And then there's also hazard category 2. So that breaks it out, and you can see in the chemically unstable gases, there's also subcategory A and subcategory B. So that's a snapshot of what we're proposing in the standard. Next slide, please. And here's how the label elements in the proposed standard will look. So for category 1A, 1B, and 2, you have the different hazard statements, and this is important. You have extremely flammable gas for hazard category 1A, flammable gas for category 1B, and flammable gas for category 2. The signal words are danger, danger, and warning. And you notice that there's no pictogram for category 2 flammable gases. Next slide. For desensitized explosives, this is a new hazard class. This is a new chapter, and it's not a new hazard, excuse me, it's a new chapter, but it is not a new hazard. This was actually captured in explosives, and occasionally some other hazard classes also address this. We decided desensitized explosives was a result of great discussions at the UN level with the subcommittee for GHS, and the United States was a big part of that discussion. And we wanted to really fully communicate the hazards with this particular hazard group. And these hazards require a lot of things. They require to be either wetted with water or alcohols, diluted with substrates, or be suspended. And we needed to make sure that these were being handled appropriately all the way down the line and not let to be dried out where they would be very highly hazardous. And we really needed to make sure that statements about this hazard class were fully addressed. Therefore, we have a new chapter entitled Desensitized Explosives. Next slide. Here's what the new criteria that we are proposing will look like. Category 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the criteria is based on the kilograms, and you can see how it's broken out there. Next slide. Here's what the label is proposed to look like. There are 4 categories across the top. Hazard category 1, 2, 3, and 4. The hazard statements, now they look very, very similar. You need to make sure that there are some changes between 3 and 4. You need to make sure you specify that. Also, signal words, their category 1 and 2 have the signal word of danger. Category 3 and 4 have the signal word of warning, and yet all 4 of them do have pictogram that need to be on the label as well. Next slide, please. Moving on to aerosols. Hazard Communication 2012 is one of the early things that was recognized that many aerosols were being classified as gases under pressure. And we were concerned that the warning didn't really differentiate between the gas cylinder and the aerosol cans. In Rev 4, there were some changes made We wanted to update the hazard statements. You'll see that there in one of the situations, there's no gas cylinder pictogram. That was a response to our stakeholders. Aerosols with a flammable component will be in category 1 and 2. Aerosols without a flammable component or no flammable components will be in category 3. So basically, we didn't really make changes to category 1 and 2 in this proposal, but we did add a new category, and that will be category 3. Most of the aerosol cans have come under gases under pressure. With this adding of category 3, we feel that this is improving the warning, and it's more clarifying to the classifier as well as the end users. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of what the proposed label elements will look like for category 1, 2, and 3 across the top. You have the hazard statements, which do change. You need to make sure that you're being clear about that. Category 1 will state extremely flammable aerosol. Pressurized container may burst if heated. Category 2 will just state flammable aerosol. There's a difference between the extremely flammable and the flammable aerosol between 1 and 2, and that the pressurized container may burst if heated. Category 3 will state just pressurized container may burst if heated. Also note that signal words for category 1 are danger, categories 2 and 3 are warning, and the third category, which we are adding in this proposal, will have no pictogram. Appendix C. So for folks, Appendix A deals with all of the health hazards. Appendix B deals with all of the physical hazards. They all come together in the required label elements, which is part of and in whole Appendix C. Here you'll find any changes that were made in Appendix A and Appendix B will be captured in Appendix C. All of the label elements that need to be on labels. It also helped foster the information that needs to be put on safety data sheets. We have updated and clarified guidance. We have clarification to the four aforementioned physical hazards, the desensitized explosives, the aerosols, the flammable gases, and the unstable gases. We've modified it for clarity, the precautionary statements. And what's really important, because location, 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 and also prime real estate on labels, it gets crowded. We've combined some of the statements, not all of the statements that you may see in Appendix C. If the intent and the words were similar, we combined statements here for ease of use. This will be primarily seen in first response, which is section 5 on a safety data sheet, and first aid measures. So pay attention to that. You can see that explicitly in the red line strikeout. And we put that up on our website so people could go to that and use that and really see right there before them what the direct changes are in this proposed standard. And then Appendix D, safety data sheets, there are some key updates in section 9, the physical and the chemical properties. We're including particle size. Now, this isn't really a big issue for the United States so much, but our European colleagues find that this is a very crucial determinant factor for their safety data sheets. So we are also putting it in there to remain harmonized. And then section 11, there's an inclusion of the interactive effects in the QSAR and the SAR read across. So you will see that as well. I will now turn the implementation issues back over to Dina.
And excuse me. So, excuse me. We are also updating the hazard communication standard to address some implementation issues that we've experienced over the years. We have learned quite a bit since 2012, and therefore we wanted to modify the standard to reflect some of these experiences. Now, the main implementation issues that we're going to address include a new definition of the least for shipment, changes to the labeling requirements to address small packages, and then we're also proposing to make some modifications to improve the safety data sheet. Now, with regards to release for shipment, we're proposing this new definition to indicate that a chemical that has been packaged and labeled in a manner in which it will be distributed or sold. So currently, OSHA requires that a chemical manufacturer, importer, or distributor who becomes newly aware of any significant information regarding the hazards of a chemical to revise the labels within 6 months of becoming aware of this new information. And they also have to ensure that chemicals shipped after that time contain the new information. So following the publication of Hazard Communication Standard 2012, we did receive many letters from manufacturers and importers, and they expressed their concerns with this provision, excuse me, since there are cases when they may learn about new significant hazard information after a chemical has already been labeled, before it's actually shipped from their facilities. And they emphasized that relabeling each individual container would require employees opening already secure packaging with the potential of harming the contents of the package or harming themselves. So in response to that, and to account for these types of products that have longer distribution cycles, we are proposing that chemicals that have been released for shipment, which again means that they've already been packaged and labeled and they're just waiting for future distribution, that they don't need to be relabeled with the new information. However, the chemical manufacturer or importer will still have to provide the updated label for each individual container along with each shipment. So again, this is just to help reduce employee exposure by limiting handling of the materials that have already been packaged. Next slide. Then there's the issue of small packages. Currently, the Hazard Communication Standard requires that all ship containers be labeled with the information that's specified in paragraph F of the standard. So that would be the product identifier, the signal word, pictograms, hazard statements, and also precautionary statements. And all of these label elements, of course, are based on the classification of the chemical. So we received many concerns from chemical manufacturers and importers that it could be very, very difficult to include all of the required information on the labels for smaller containers. So in response to their concerns, through letters of interpretation and also the directive, OSHA provided a practical accommodation for them to address situations where it's just not feasible to put all of the Hazard Communication Standard required label information directly on these smaller containers, even through the use of pull-out labels, fold-out labels, or tags. And the practical accommodation allows for limited information to be included on the smaller container label, but it still requires that the complete label information be provided on the outside package. We are also proposing some improvements to the safety data sheet. Now in section 2, which is the hazards identification section, we are proposing to clarify where and how chemical hazard information should be presented. Specifically, we're proposing to clarify that subsection 2A include hazards associated with a change in the chemical's physical form under normal conditions of use. And for example, for a chemical that poses a combustible dust hazard when processed, but not in the form in which it's shipped, the combustible dust hazard still has to be included in section 2A. For section 3, which is the composition information on ingredients section, we are proposing to revise the trade secret provisions to allow for concentration ranges to be also withheld as a trade secret. And then also in section 8, which is the exposure controls personal protection section of the safety data sheet, we're proposing to clarify that in section 8A, that all ingredients or constituents that are listed in section 3 also have to be in section 8A. But if the ingredient or constituent does not have a PEL, TLV, or other exposure limit, then the ingredient or constituent would not need to be put in section 8. Now, in the proposal, we'll also be addressing some issues that affect those who have to comply with both OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard as well as Canada's WHMIS 2015. And the first issue I'd like to highlight is the concentration ranges for confidential business information. So we're now proposing to require that when an ingredient's exact concentration or concentration range is claimed as a trade secret, that the safety data sheet has to include the ingredient's concentration range selected from a prescribed list of ranges. And this will align with Canada, as the prescribed list of ranges that are being proposed are consistent with those that are already being used there in Canada. With regard to small packages, Canada provides exemptions from certain labeling requirements, such as precautionary statements for small capacity containers of 100 mils or less. They also provide some labeling exemptions for containers of 3 mils or less, if the label interferes with the normal use of the product. So in order to better align with them, we're considering similar small container labeling provisions as well. And then lastly, for hazards not otherwise classified, OSHA does not require labeling currently for hazard not otherwise classified. However, Canada does require a pictogram, signal word, hazard statements, and precautionary statements for health and physical hazards not otherwise classified. So to better align with Canada, we're proposing to allow an exclamation mark pictogram to be used for HNOCs. And with this proposal, we're also trying to improve alignment with other US agencies. So with regard to the Department of Transportation, we did work together with DOT to provide guidance to stakeholders to clarify how to properly label bulk containers, bulk chemicals in transport. And based on that guidance, we're proposing to clarify that labels for bulk shipments of hazardous chemicals may either be on the immediate container or may be transmitted with shipping papers, bills of lading, or other electronic means. We're also under Appendix C currently states that where a pictogram required by DOT appears on a ship container, that the hazard communication standard pictogram for the same hazard shall not appear. And this provision was intended to prevent confusion associated with having two different representations of the same hazard on the container. However, DOT has determined that there is no conflict, so therefore we're proposing to indicate that there can be, in fact, a DOT pictogram and a hazard communication standard pictogram for the same hazard on a ship container. And with regard to OSHA's proposed release for shipment definition, we tried to align our definition as closely as possible with EPA's definition of release for shipment, which addresses existing stock of pesticide products. So now I'd like to turn it back over to Janet.
Well, thanks, Dee, and thanks, Jen. So what I want to do is just go through the issues and options section. We always include issues and options we usually do for most of our proposed rules. In the issues section, you'll find a series of questions that we would like information from our stakeholders. So if you could take a look at that, that would be great. In the options section, we're actually proposing to include certain things from revision 8. So as I said earlier, we started with revision 7, and these rulemakings take a while. But in the meantime, revision 8 has been published, and revision 9 is about ready to be published in July. There was very little difference between Rev 7 and Rev 8, except for some really interesting things like in Appendix A. What we are proposing is to include an expanded use of non-animal test methods for classification of skin corrosion and skin irritants in Chapter 3.2. The basic framework is the same. The tiers are a little different because we've added more information about non-animal testing, and there's a lot more descriptions on how to classify using non-animal test methods. So we're asking for feedback from stakeholders about whether we should include this or not. In Appendix B, we're asking if we should include additional language for classifying criteria for aerosol. So it would be a little more information, background on how to classify these materials. We're also asking about new hazard categories in aerosols, chemicals under pressure. Should we include this? And for Appendix C, we have updated precautionary statements. As I said earlier, we learn a lot from implementation, and we learn a lot as science evolves. And it's not just the hard sciences as far as biology or physical, but also behavioral sciences. So as the GHS has been implemented and as our understandings have changed, we've updated these precautionary statements to be clearer to people. So we're asking for feedback on that as well. Now, as far as the next step in the rulemaking process, we are encouraging comments to the NPRM. They are due by April 19th, unless we get a request for an extension, and if it's granted. It's important to include supportive as well as critical comments. And by that, I mean, I mentioned non-animal testing. If you support the inclusion of non-animal testing, it's very important to say that. If you do not support it, then it's important to say that as well and tell us why. So the reasons behind, the data behind is also very important. We take all of that information into account when we are determining the final outcome of the rule. So hearing from people is very important. And with that, we're here to take questions. These are our contact information. You can also, I'm sure you can get that through ILMA as well. So with that, let's see. We can take questions. I'm going to stop sharing, hopefully.
Hi, I just want to remind everyone to submit your questions if you have any in the Q&A section. We have a few questions that we wanted to pose, and I'm going to ask Matt and Ann to unmute and turn on their cameras. Before we get into the Q&A, ILMA recently conducted a survey of its members in order to gather data about how this rule potentially affects our manufacturing members. And we've gotten a few results in. Matt, do you want to talk about that and tell us how it's going?
Sure. So if you haven't seen the survey, we've got about 27 responses. I know there's a bit more than 27 of you participating here. There will be a link to the survey on ILMA's website, I believe. The more data we get, the more helpful it will be for us to craft a public comment for OSHA. So there's a couple of numbers that I thought were particularly interesting that I wanted to share from the responses we received. So the first was the number of SDSs. Back in for HCS 2012, the number that came out was that ILMA responsible for about 40% of SDSs. So the median number from respondents has been about 200 to 300 SDSs for ILMA members. I mean, that's just the median. Some people had over 1,000, some had less than 100.
That would be the median number, the per company number, that based on median
Right.
of the results received.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the estimated cost for respondents was about $400 to $500 per SES and label, and just in the updating, not necessarily including the man hours and the checking for compliance. So if you're looking at 200 SDSs at about $400 each, that's $80,000. I mean, that's a significant amount. The more economic data we can provide, the better. So please really use the survey. And the estimated time was about 3 to 6 months to review these changes, just given the sheer amount of SDSs and labels. Some of this is related to the changes in what has to go into the SES, things like the physical chemistry changes under normal conditions of use. Like I said, I mean, the people we've received, thank you very much. Everybody else, the more data you add, the easier it will be for us to really present a clear view of how this impacts our members. So please.
If you haven't seen the survey, we're asking one per company, one per manufacturing member be submitted. And you can email communications@ilma.org and they will send you a link to the survey. So if you missed those emails, please send us an email. We'll make sure you get it. Okay, Matt, you had a couple of questions. I know you had one that you wanted to ask about.
Sure. So the first question I had was the reasoning behind the addition of the date release for shipment on labels, and how that resulted in an estimated savings. I mean, in the rule, it said about an estimated savings of, I think it was 28 million. We're just a little bit, just wanted to kind of break that down a little bit.
So I'll take the first part, and then Sutton will take the second part. So this is a proposal, and we're asking for feedback. What we're trying to do is better align our definition of release for shipment with EPA. So we're asking for feedback on this. If companies would find this cumbersome, or if this is not how they do with EPA, then we of course want to hear that. So that was the intent, was to make our release for shipment more in line with EPA's requirements. And as for the cost, that'll be Sutton.
Sure. So Deanna kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. The establishments that would be involved, these production cycles can be very lengthy between when they're produced, and then they have a long shelf life. So something could be produced, wrapped for shipment, and labeled, and then if there was a need, it could involve them having to kind of cut through all of the package material, potentially damage the product, and then redo everything. And so this is kind of an accommodation to say you don't have to do that. And so therefore employers and establishments are able to realize the cost savings. You don't have kind of the material cost. Some of the feedback we got said that oftentimes it could be the cost to redo everything could exceed the value of the product. So it would just be discarded. So that's kind of what goes into our calculation when we're showing that this would result in cost savings over time.
Thanks.
Okay. I also have a question. I appreciate your presentation. It was very interesting and informative. Could you explain the agency's thought process behind the preliminary determination that the proposed action is actually deregulatory?
So I can answer the first part, and if Sutton wants to chime in, that's great. So this was a determination made under the previous administration guidelines on economic impact. This designation really no longer applies as the guidelines have been rescinded, but it was really a determination of if you have so much cost savings, then it's considered deregulatory. I don't know if Sutton wants to get into specifics, but that was a language left over from the previous administration. So apologies for that.
Yeah, that's basically it. It reduces the requirements on employers, so we consider it deregulatory. When you look at kind of the data tables, you'll see that even though there are some provisions that incur costs, such as training, familiarization, those are far outweighed by the amount of cost savings that we get from other areas. Kind of further, all of the costs incurred are assumed to be incurred in the first year, kind of one-time cost, whereas the cost savings will accrue annually for employers. So that is kind of the way that we arrive at being a deregulatory action.
All right, I've got a quick question on some of the changes to the SDS. So I noticed that there was this addition of foreseeable emergency. So it wasn't really defined. I was hoping to get some sort of idea of what foreseeable emergency means and how that applies to usages outside of those instructed by the manufacturer. Or is it just any possible emergency? This isn't really directed at Sutton, but I see you're still on my screen here.
So this is Janet, unless Sutton wants to answer. So, this was actually something that we took out of the directive, the compliance directive. And it's, you know, it's kind of in general, if a manufacturer, if there is a foreseeable interaction that will cause a foreseeable emergency, then we would expect that to be on the SDS. And it's better defined in the directive, but it's something that is reasonably anticipated to be foreseen. I hope that helps. I would go to the directive for better language, and they actually give an example.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so that leads into this question in a way. Many of our members have organic chemical products, complex mixtures actually. So for those types of materials, for organic chemical products, which are intended to be diluted for use, oftentimes microbiological degradation is expected. And the diluted chemical over time can include bacterial, fungal, and degraded chemical components. So should this potential physical structure, form, or reaction caused by these semi-expected contaminations be handled on the SDS?
So I think in general, if these interactions can be reasonably anticipated, then we would expect the manufacturers to supply the information on the SDS. And this really isn't specific to organics, as we don't regulate the term. But as with all changes, you know, we're asking for comment. But yes, in general, we would expect that if there is a change under normal conditions of use that you reasonably anticipate to happen, then we would expect that to be placed on the SDS. Someone has a hand up. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question here. And I guess it goes back to the release of shipment information, a more detailed explanation. I don't know if you can help with that. And the sub part of that question, is it only for EPA pesticides or all chemicals?
It is what only for EPA pesticides?
I'm assuming that she's referring to the release for shipment information. Karen, if you can clarify your question, it would be appreciated. In the meantime, Anne and Matt, any additional questions?
If you don't mind, yeah, based on your comment from my last question, would you expect, because these products, this expected response is actually in an in-use product that is not in the form that the original SDS was provided for? It almost sounds like the expectation is that there would be an SDS for the product in use.
So I actually have some information here from the compliance directive, and so let me read that to you because I think that that's a little more clear. They actually gave an example, so my apologies. So a manufacturer importer is out of compliance if it does not provide hazard information on a known use or should have reasonably expected to know may occur, even it is not the intended use under normal conditions of use or foreseeable emergency. For example, a product forms a combustible dust when ground into a powder. And the manufacturer knows this, but the manufacturer intends its products to be melted, not ground. And it perceives that there is no hazard from combustible dust if used as intended. However, the manufacturer must still warn downstream users of the known potential hazards from combustible dust. And that information must appear in the SDS. So I think that directly goes to your question, that even if it's not in the original form, if the manufacturer knows that's how somebody's going to use it and they can reasonably foresee that something that there is a hazard, then they need to put that on the SDS. Does that make sense? That's currently in the compliance directive. Because this is a so this is how we're interpreting it, but this is a proposal. So having said that, we are asking for feedback on that. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Janet. Karen sent this message. She was asking for a better explanation of release for shipment information. She said, it looks like the date is required on the label. Just want to be sure it was only pesticides.
No, no, I think that's the example that we gave because that's what EPA does, and it's for these and so one of the examples that we gave in the NPRM was about these palletized materials, and some of them are agricultural products that tend to kind of sit on the shelf for a while. But it's not intended just for that. It is for anything that has a long distribution cycle. And may sit. So it's not a specific requirement just for pesticides. And again, we're asking for feedback.
Sorry about that. I don't know if you can see the Q&A. If you click on it.
Oh, okay.
Down a little bit, but from Ron Powell, we have a question. If during blending, the hazards associated with a component are significantly diminished, e.g. caustic is neutralized, rendering it no longer corrosive, how would that affect reporting requirements?
I'm gonna request help from the audience. That would be Jen or Dina. If you have an answer for this.
I'm looking and I do not. So perhaps we can get back to Ron on this particular question.
You know, this, because what I was thinking was this sounds like a good question for a letter of interpretation.
Okay, thank you. Matt will make a note of that and he will pursue that.
Okay.
Can I add to that? This is Jen Lawless. Can I add to that? So
Sure.
on what we would need to know if you're going to submit a letter of interpretation, we would need to know if this is a normal process that you're doing. Do you receive this powder, liquid, or solid in the concentrated corrosive state? How is it being handled before it is being neutralized? And, you know, there's still a hazard there when it comes into the receiving dock, and I'm assuming is going to be put on a shelf or put in an area for storage prior to whatever neutralizing it's going to go through. So those are some of the details that we would need to know.
Okay. Here's a question. Will the implementation dates for chemical suppliers and compounders blenders be different this time? If they are the same, it is impossible for ILMA members to comply on time.
We actually have proposed a kind of a tiered approach so that people with blending mixtures, those are in the second year of implementation. So it is a tiered approach. So, so that is what we've proposed. Certainly we welcome feedback.
Thank you. That's great. We also have a question. Hydraulic oil may be combustible, but a rupture hose will cause a spray which becomes flammable. Do we need to state this?
Is this a normal process or is this an accident?
John, if you could clarify your question, we will try to get an answer for you. Is this a normal process or is it an accident? I don't know what his intent was there. Will users of the chemical ingredient be required to report to the manufacturer if they are using the material in a way that is not intended? For example, if manufacturing states material is intended to be melted, but user plans to grind it to a powder, does user need to notify manufacturer of intended use if different than stated on the SDS?
So I think we have a letter of interpretation for this, but let me ask Jen and Dina. This sounds kind of like if a downstream user is altering product, then do they need to come up with their own SDS?
Yes,
Or is that-
I believe we do have a letter of interpretation, and that can be found on our interpretations tab on our safety and health topics page for hazard communication. We list all of the letters of interpretation that were the result of hazard communication 2012. And then we also list historic letters of interpretation, but it would be found in the HCS 2012 and that's on our safety and health topics page.
And I guess to clarify, so the letters of interpretation are provided by the enforcement. So we write the standards, they implement, they enforce, and they do the interpretation. So generally, those letters of interpretation are provided by our enforcement directive.
Okay, great. John got back with the clarification about the hydraulic oil. It says hydraulic oil may be combustible, but a rupture hose will cause a spray, which becomes flammable. Do we need to state this? And his comment is it's a normal and regular accident in the workplace.
So if it's a normal, it sounds like a normal condition of use, it would need to be on the SDS.
Okay. Does Ann or Matt, any further questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. You talked a little bit about extensions of time for public comments. Either if we request a hearing, then I believe you said it was there was an automatic extension of time.
No. Those are two separate things. You can request a hearing and you can request an extension.
Right.
Requesting a hearing doesn't automatically extend the comment period.
Okay.
There is an additional comment period for people who attend the hearing and who supply comments. So that may be where that came from. But those are only for people who participated in the hearing.
Okay. So the second question is I mean, I guess one, do you anticipate extending the time? And two, what is, you mentioned that there might not be granted. I mean, I guess you may not be able to answer this, but.
So we have been asked for extensions before. They're usually a 30-day extension. We have not granted some in the past. especially for those that we've already given like a 90-day period. This one only has a 60-day. If you're only asking for 30 days, we will try to make a reasonable accommodation for anyone if you are having issues with providing comments, given that you provide those reasons and they are reasonable. So we do try to make reasonable accommodations. We have denied on occasion when the request is not reasonable.
Thank you.
Okay, I do have one more question. There is so much development going on with lubricants, especially engine oils. I want to know how long it takes to get approval or categorized from OSHA when a new product is submitted.
So we do not categorize products. That is the responsibility of the manufacturer or the producer. We do not grant approval. That is their responsibility.
Okay. Anne, did you have anything else before we close?
Yeah, going back to the release date for release for shipment date. And I really understand completely what you were saying about for products that sit on the shelf for an extended period of time. I think what may be most concerning to many members is the products that don't sit on the shelf or on the manufacturing floor for a long period of time, that there are already lot numbers that are in use and things by everyone, that you have to go and knowing, you know, it may be there a week, but then when it's ready to ship, you've got to put a release for shipment date on it. And I think that will cause extra work. And I think that may be where a lot of the concern is. Could you speak to that?
So this is exactly the type of information that we're looking for. So if you can provide comments along those lines, it would really help us try to define the parameters for this provision. And we can make changes to that. So based on the information that we receive, we will take that input into consideration. So this is exactly the type of information that we want to hear. So thank you. If I can
just build on Janet's comment for a minute, you mentioned, you know, increased amount of time with work. That's especially important for us in the economic side, since any changes we make would affect kind of cost savings calculation. So the amount of data that you can provide on what you would actually see kind of in the work environment is supremely helpful and greatly appreciated.
We did get a question, is it possible to release it for shipment without shipping it?
Janet, I think that's to
That's a good question.
nice face, by the way. I think that speaks to, I always forget to put my audio on or my visual on. I think that speaks to an LOI that we have that may be not exactly the same situation, but I do believe that it may speak to some of the aspects. And it goes back to fertilizer in the ag world, where fertilizer is palletized and shipped, but then can be brought back from a farm to like a farm supply store, if not used in that season, and that farm would get credit for it. So it can go, there are many iterations of that. And I know it's Dr. Sue. I'm going to say I'm going to mispronounce her name, and I apologize. Dr. Sue Frenetic. I think that's the LOI. I don't know the date. It does have to do with it's in the LOI, so letters of interpretation for the HAZCON 2012 standard, which is a drop-down tab on our OSHA Safety and Health HAZCON Safety and Health Topics page. Boy,
and that's
really long, drawn out. Then when I go into that, like a mental trying to see where it is, direct you guys, I kind of go off on a little tangent. Sorry about that.
Well, no, but so glad you brought that up because we did actually cite that LOI in the NPRM, so it would also be on the docket. So it would be in the
There you go.
NPRM in the SumX section, which I know is 400 pages. I apologize.
There you go.
But it's also in it's also in the docket, so it would you could find it there as well.
Teamwork makes dream work. We get that.
Okay, we will have Matt look into that as well. Matt, I hope you've taken a lot of notes here today. We are now right about an hour that we've been going, a little over an hour. And I want to thank the OSHA team for taking the time to come here today and answer all of our questions and hear all of our concerns. And ILMA continues to gather information to submit its comments. We will be submitting on behalf of the industry, but we will encourage companies that have concerns to submit their questions as well. If you haven't seen the survey, Matt actually posted it in the chat section. So you can click that link or copy that link there. And we will make that available as well after the presentation. Thank you also to Ann and Matt for your help today with questions. And I want to thank Chevron Oronite, our sponsor of this session, for their generosity. And everyone today, thanks so much for joining us. If you have further questions or concerns, always reach out, communications@ilma.org. Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.